1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58. Y'all got it? Lord, y'all going to talk to me today, ain't you? All right. All right. And this is what Paul writes. He says, therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. You may be seated in the presence of the Lord. I'd like to preach again from the topic, Overcoming the Spirit of Average, Part 2. Overcoming the Spirit of Average, Part 2. Last week, we were in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Peter encouraged us to understand that we are a holy nation and a royal priesthood. Last week, I tried to help us understand that if we are going to overcome the spirit of average, to overcome the spirit of commonality, that we must understand that we are different. When we looked at the text last week, Peter describes us as a holy nation. The word holy means different. It means separate. It means set apart. In other words, it means God, as he has called darkness into his marvelous light, has set us apart, and we are different. In other words, the text suggests to us last week, as I try to remind us this week, that you can no longer be what you used to be because you are a holy nation. Act like everybody else I grew up with because I'm a part of a holy nation. I can't talk like everybody at work talks because I'm part of a holy nation. As a matter of fact, there's some people in my family I can't act like anymore because I'm part of a holy. The reason why some of us never move beyond being average or common or just mundane or mediocre is because some of us fail to realize that we are different in a holy nation and royal priesthood. It suggests to us that we are different. Look at your neighbor and say, we are different. You're different. That means you ought to act different. That means this church ought to be different. This church ought not be like any other church because this is a different church, because this is different people. Listen, holy nation. And so as we begin to embark upon this journey of breaking up and overcoming the spirit of average, we've got to understand that you are a different person. But this week, at Paul writes in his letter to the Corinthian church, he's trying to help them Gentile believers, help them understand who they are in Christ. As a matter of fact, he's doing the same thing with them that Peter was doing. As a matter of fact, he's trying to help the church understand that as a church, you're different. In other words, I know where you come from, but just because where you come from there doesn't mean you've got to stay where you come from. Many of the Gentiles come from pagan beliefs. They had come from worshiping many gods. They were used to living a lifestyle that was not in line with the word or the will of God. And as a result, many of them brought their old lifestyle to the church. Y'all missed that. They brought the outside inside the church. And much of what they were doing inside the church was no different than what they did outside the church. And Paul, as he was writing to encourage this church, helps them to wait a minute. Listen, I know that there are some things you're still trying to understand about your faith. He says, but I know that this is a journey of faith. He says, but I need you to understand that you can no longer be what you used to be. And he helps us understand the principle of how we should overcome our average behavior. And he says we ought to be persistent. Look at your neighbor and say persistent. We give up on stuff too soon. When stuff get hard, folk want to throw in the towel. When there are obstacles that are presented in front of us, we want to give up. Many of us don't know how to struggle anymore now that life has become too easy. Many of us forget what it was like to have to boil water and share bath water with your siblings. I know the younger folk don't understand nothing about that, but some of you older folk do. You want to be instead of being the last bathtub, you wanted to be the first one in the bath because you had to share bath water. I know the new school kids don't understand nothing like that. Persistence. Stuff get hard now, we give up. Jobs get hard, we want to quit. Families get tough, we want to walk away. Church start acting crazy and we want to leave now. We don't know how to be persistent. Come on, this morning. Paul in this particular text helps us understand that if you want to overcome the spirit of average in your life, you got to learn how to be persistent. Say persistence. Here it is in the text. These Gentile believers, Paul is trying to instruct them about what they need to believe in faith. And there's one major hang-up being that they have. They don't understand the resurrection of believers. They don't understand that believers, when the trump sounds and the dead in Christ is going to be raised up and those of us who are still living going to be caught up to meet him in there. They don't understand that. They're trying to hold on to their old beliefs. And Paul is trying to help them understand. He says, I'm going to show you a mystery. Not all sleep. He said, behold, when the trump sounds, we're going to be changed in the moment of a twinkling of an eye. And he says, but listen, I know you don't understand that. He said, but this is what we believe. We know God is going to come back for those who are his. And he gets down to verse 58, Brother Van, and he says, therefore, brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because your labor is not in vain. Paul tells us in this particular text, whenever you encounter hard times, because life will bring you some trouble. He says, whatever you do, don't give up. And that's a word for somebody here today. Don't give up. When life begins to throw you curveballs, you can't give up, because you are a very average individual, because there can be no average Christians as long as you got Jesus. I wish I had some help this morning. God has not called us to be average people. He has not called us to be just like everybody else, because the Bible, he that is in me than he that's in the world. He says, listen, you can't be normal when you are a Christian. You can't love like everybody else. You don't have joy. Like your joy is a joy that nobody else understands. It's a peace that surpasses all understanding. He says, you can't be like everybody else when you have Christ. And he says to us in this text, he says, you've got to learn how to be persistent. He says, if you want to last through the troubles and through the doubts and through the ups and downs of your, how to hang in there. He says, life as a Christian is not going to be easy. He said, but you got to learn how to stick to it. You got to know what you believe. He says, if you believe that God is, then you ought to believe that God will. I wish I had some help in here. Do you believe that God is able to do it for you? He says, you got to be persistent. Say persistence. In the text, he addresses them in this verse, even though he's the direction of the dead, he helps us to understand what it means for us to live an extraordinary life. He says, one, you got to learn how to be persistent. You got to learn how not to give up. You got to learn how not to throw in the towel. He says, as Christians, easy. He says one of the things that makes us who we are is that we don't give up easy, because we know that even though God does not show up when we want him to, God always shows up on time. Have I got any help up in here? Is there anybody in here that has ever had some face, you've ever had some problems, and you've ever had some hills you had to climb, and you didn't know how you were going to get through it, but you look back over your life and you realize that God gave you peace, and God gave you strength, and God gave you joy, God gave you hope, God gave you power, peace, God gave you healing. It was nobody but God that made a way for you, because God he's able. He says in the text, he says, my beloved brother, he says, I need to help y'all. He says, because I know your faith. He says, but I can't let you give up on faith. He says, you have come too far to give up now. He says, you have come through some dangerous times, but listen, you're still here. He says, so you can't give up. He says, I know there's some things and some people you out of faith and trying to get you to question your faith, trying to get you not to walk in faith. He says, but don't give up right now. He says, you got to be steadfast. Now watch this. The text says, I'm going to give you three quick things on how to live above average. One, you got to be steadfast. In other words, you got to stand firm. The word steadfast means standing firm. You got to stand firm. Now, in other words, you cannot allow anybody to take away from you what you believe. I wish I had somebody in here. Challenges come your way. What makes us extraordinary in our living is that nobody can shake us on who God is. That's why when the president make crazy racist comments, you don't trip, because you know who God is. You know that God is the It's not the president. It's not the prime minister. It's not any autocratic governments. No, it is God that gives power to any government. And when we as believers understand that God is in control, you don't worry about whether stock prices go up or stock prices go down, because God is your provision. Y'all looking a little quiet now. I got to help myself this morning. Listen, there are some of us who give up, and the world starts getting doubtful and the world starts going crazy. We start losing our minds too. But I want to remind you, just like Paul reminded the early church in Corinth, he says, listen, you don't serve those people. You serve God, and you are where you are because can't nobody move you but God. Can't nobody take nobody away from but God. Listen, it is God that gives you strength and God that gives you power. It's God that's your help. It is nobody but God. You got to stand firm on what you believe, but you got to know what you believe. When you know that God is omnipresent, you know he's everywhere. I don't need no bracelet to tell me to act right, because, listen, I know God is everywhere. I know the Holy Spirit is always watching out, always pushing me to righteousness and holiness. Listen, I don't need nobody to tell me to act right, because it was God that saved my soul. It is God that redeemed me and God that saved me. You got to be steadfast in what you believe. Then he says, you got to be immovable. In other words, not only must you stand firm, you can't let nobody shake you. He says, if you want to live above average, you got to know what your goal is. And the problem that many of us have in our lives is that people distract us too easily. Distract us too easily. Paul encourages us, not only must you stand firm in what you believe, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ, he says you must be immovable in the direction. It's in the text. You can't have a goal to lose weight one day and then overeat the next day. You'll never reach your goal as long as you only committed for a short period of time. Come here. You'll never reach your goal if you change the goal every day. It doesn't matter how long it takes me to get there. I know the direction I'm going. Y'all missed it. I know I struggle with thoughts. And I know I struggle sometimes with my talk. It doesn't matter how long it takes me to get. I just got to be moving in the right direction. And Paul says, listen, you got to be immovable in the direction you are headed. There's some of our Christian walk, we get frustrated. We get frustrated, we really do, if we're honest with ourselves, because we feel the word don't work fast enough. We feel like not move fast enough. Now, I know I'm talking to more people than talking back to me, but some of us, we recommit for a short period of time, because we want the word to start working real quick. But I want to remind you, you in a marathon. Let me help you. Let me help you today, Minister Carrington. In Chinese culture, they have what's called a bamboo tree, a Chinese bamboo tree, and bamboo tree they plant a seed, and for 4 years they water it and fertilize it with no results. It takes 4 years. 4 years they plant a tree, water it, and fertilize it, and they don't see nothing. 4 years. You have to do it every day. Every day they are disciplined to water and fertilize the tree for 4 years a day. And on the 5th year, they water and fertilize the tree every day. And in 5 weeks, the tree grows 90 feet. Every day, they water the bamboo tree and fertilize it for 4 years and don't see nothing. Every day, they're disciplined to go water and don't see no results. They don't give up. They don't give in. But on the 5th year, they water it and fertilize it for 5 weeks, and it grows in 5 weeks. The tree don't grow 90 feet in 5 weeks because they started doing something in the 5th year. It grows because they were doing something for 4 years when they didn't see nothing. A second. Because some of y'all think that God don't move fast enough for you, but you ain't got enough patience and persistence to hang on to God. But don't you know God, who has begun a good work in you, is going to see it until the day of completion? And you may not see it today, tomorrow, but if you allow yourself to open up this book and allow God to fertilize your heart and water your soul every day of your life, you don't know when God gonna shoot you up and grow you up, because God is able. But we don't want to stick to nothing. We don't want to hold on. And that's why some of us don't have no power in life, and some of us don't have no good prayer life, because we don't allow God to water us and fertilize us and see nothing. How do you pray for your children, but yet they still out in them streets? How do you hold on to your spouse, but yet they still seem to not be wanting to be with you? How do you in there and have trust in the church when everybody in the church don't act right? Paul says some plant, some water, but it's God that provides increase. To this morning, but you need to understand that God is trying to get you to hang in there. Some of y'all don't know that God is trying to water your soul. You got to be persistent. You got to hang on in there. He says, be steadfast, stand immovable, knowing what your goal is. Then he says, here it is, this is how you get to above average living. Always abounding in the word of the Lord. Yeah, that writes a whole lot of folk off. Because average people don't work for God. People sit and soak up. Average people want to be served. But extraordinary people don't ask, God, what can you do for me? They ask, God, out of all that you've done for me, I'm going to give myself back to you. Now, I know I'm not going to get a lot of amens right there, but I'm trying to help us understand how to live above average. Because it ought to be, in our day, we ought to be tired of being just like everybody else. I'm telling you, I'm not here to be no average pastor. I'm not here to preach an average sermon. I'm not here to get an average amen. God has called me to excellence. He's called us to above average living. And in everything we do, we're on top. There are people, but I'm telling you, but that people. Because when all you've seen is average and mediocre, it's hard for us to be pushed to extraordinary excellence. He says, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. In other words, he says, not sometimes, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Sticking to this faith thing long enough for God to be able to use you, no matter how great or how small. When we grow up in faith, God ought to be maturing us for usefulness, not to just sit. God never matures you to sit. He matures you to serve. Now, I'm going to teach this for weeks, so you better get used to this today. Preach it like I normally do. So many of us allow the enemy to tell us we too busy to do anything for God. Oh, I'm done. I'm almost done. Point. It's real quick. Some of us are so busy for doing other stuff, we have no time for God. But what Paul suggests in the text, based upon faith, we mature in what we believe. It translates in how we serve, which means there's a direct correlation between your service and your maturity. People who have a hard time are also people that struggle with spiritual maturity. However, let me go ahead and hurry on to a close, because I see I done ruffled some feathers this morning. But it's truth. Because some of us give up on life and you give up on faith too easy. But the differentiating characteristic of a believer, and the reason why many of us and some of us don't live life, we live above average, we live in the spirit of excellence, is because we are persistent in our faith. The maturity of our faith don't happen overnight. You got to keep working it while it's working you. But let me give you my last point. He says, always abounding in the work of the Lord. In other words, we got to always be on our assignment for God. Here's something, ladies and gentlemen. As a believer, you are always on assignment. You're not ever in a place where you put your faith on the shelf. You are always on assignment. Let me say that again. Everywhere you go, you are always a representative of Jesus Christ. You are an ambassador of the King, if you're one of his. There's not a time when you can check out and put your faith aside, because our faith is what moves us. Let me make that plain to you. And I'm going to go ahead and take my seat and open the doors of the church. Last week, I realized that the postage was going up next week. They increasing the price of the stamp. And I got kind of perturbed at that, because I was unaware, as I was about to mail my letter, that the price of postage was going up. And I started thinking for a second as I had my letter in hand and I'm trying to put postage on it, trying to make sure I didn't the date that the postage increased. The stamp started talking to me. And I said, Mr. Stamp, this is going to be the last time you're going to be on this envelope for this price. And the stamp said, that's all right. because when I get to my destination, my assignment will be complete. I said, Mr. Stamp, what you talking about? He said, I'm the only one who when I stick to an envelope, my assignment is not complete until I get to my destination. I said, wait a minute. Oh, don't clap yet. Hold on, because he was still talking. I said, what you mean? He said, if I don't stick to this envelope, I'll never get, this envelope will never get to its destination. Y'all missed it. If I don't stay, no matter how much it costs on this envelope ain't gonna never get to its destination. Come here. He says, if I peel off, if I let go, this envelope gonna get lost. I said, Mr. Envelope, I said, listen, you need that stamp to stick on you, don't you? He said, yes, sir, I do. He says, if this stamp don't stick to me, he says, I can't get to where I'm going. He says, listen, some of us, he says, I got to be persistent to assignment, or else the one that I'm supposed to be carrying will never get there. Come here for a second. There are some of you that need to stick to your assignment, or else you'll never get to your destination. But I know somebody else who did stick to an assignment, and 2,000 years ago, on Calvary, they nailed him in his hands and they nailed him in his feet, and he stuck to an old rugged cross, and he died one Friday night, and early Sunday morning he got up because he stuck to his assignment. And because he stuck to his assignment, I've got peace, I've got power, I've got victory, because he stuck to his assignment. And the reason why we can live above average life is because Jesus stuck to his assignment. And I'm so glad this morning that because of my assignment, I can stick to my assignment. Doesn't matter how many problems I have, I'm going to stick to my assignment. Doesn't matter how many people talk about me and scandalize my name, I'm going to stick to my assignments. Whether I have money or don't, I'm going to stick. Whether I have health or sickness, I'm going to stick to my assignment. And if I'm going to live an extraordinary life as a believer with the power and victory of God, I've got to stick to my assignment. My first assignment is to be holy, a royal priesthood, to walk and to be steadfast and unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. That's our assignment today, but you got to stick to it. You got to stick to your assignment. When all else fails, you got to stick to your assignment. When you don't want to stick to it, you got to stick to your assignment. Because the envelope will never get to its destination unless the and some of you will never get to your spiritual destination unless you stick to it.